Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the summit stage. We're well into Tuesday afternoon now, and it's time that we brought up the subject of data and privacy in our new world. What's happening to our data? What are the key implications right now? And how will the pandemic affect and what we know about data and how we use it? With us is the top man on technology. It's Mike Butcher, who is the editor at large with TechCrunch, and he's going to be guiding us through this discussion. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Joy. Thanks very much. It's been incredible. CogX has really pulled the stops out for putting this together under difficult circumstances. So congratulations to them. It's my delight to introduce a little panel that we're going to be running about data privacy. We'll be hearing from Gavin Starks from Icebreaker One and Brittany Kaiser, or the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. But data privacy is never far away from tech, of course, but in the era of COVID, exactly how is it going to play out? Let's hear from the panel. Let's bring them on. Thanks very much for joining. Brittany Kaiser, as I said, just to reintroduce, Brittany Kaiser, Cambridge Analytica whistleblower and author, and now data privacy rights campaigner, and Gavin Starks, the founder of Icebreaker One. A little known fact about Gavin actually is that he wrote the book on open banking and now appears to be attempting to write the book, shall we say, on open climate data, which is an entirely, frankly, brand new and also very sort of brand new area. I'm going to turn to you firstly, Brittany. Thanks so much for joining the CogX sessions. I want to put to you something which I think is probably going to be exactly where you're thinking right now. You've been a campaigner about data rights for the last couple of years since the whole Cambridge Analytica incident, the whistleblowing that you were part of. But many people at this point in time really often feel that fighting the pandemic, tracing people with COVID-19, tracing those contacts is going to take precedence over issues like privacy. What do you say to people like that who are advocating that we should set privacy aside, data privacy aside in the era of COVID-19?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Mike. And thank you, CogX, for having us here today and organizing this in a way where obviously we're producing more data. We wish we could be in London together on a stage, but this is a fabulous opportunity. So in order to address the issue of where we're at right now, I think we have to recognize that the data rights and privacy movement has had a massive wave of momentum over the past few years. For the first time, we had a landmark privacy law in the United States, CCPA, passed in California on January 1st, and not long afterwards, we're struck with a global pandemic. And this is the first time since 9/11 where we've seen a rush around the world for governments to implement emergency legislation in order to allow the collection. I think most people remember the Patriot Act, especially in the United States, where we decided to give away our fundamental rights and freedoms in order to prevent terrorism. Well, now we're faced with a similar discussion, which is how do we save human life? How do we band together in order to do this? How do we use technology in order to do this faster and more efficiently? Obviously, contact tracing apps have been popping up around the world. Some of them have already proven to be successful and some of them not so. Some of them have even been picked apart as massive privacy violations. Now in the United States, when we've seen a surge of riots across America and even obviously peaceful protests, we've seen reports of authorities that are saying they're using the same contact tracing systems that were meant to save human lives from the spread of coronavirus, and instead they're using to track and trace protesters. Now that could either be used for good things or it could easily be abused. For the past few years is sometimes a fine line. So the past many weeks, I've been working with the state of New York on the first piece of emergency legislation on data protection during coronavirus contact tracing app usage. So we're looking to regulate exactly how people can opt in to their data being taken or opt out, where that data is going to be stored, for how long, how it can be used or not. For instance, it not being able to be shared with authorities, and what purposes it could possibly be monetized for, such as your data could not be used to make money for anyone that wants to advertise to you, but perhaps it could be monetized as possible data that would go into vaccines, for instance. So these are the types of debates that we're having right now. And even this past week, we've had the federal Congress of the United States put forth the first piece of legislation around data protection and contact tracing as well. So it's definitely something that I think countries around will pay attention to.
So I suppose what you're saying is that there is a line between allowing governments and health authorities to do contact tracing and a line at which they should not cross. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And we can pass new laws and regulation rather quickly that will protect the rights and fundamental freedoms of citizens while allowing us to use this to protect human life from the growing pandemic.
Gavin, if I could turn to you, what's your view on this subject? Do you think that that we should, in the era of COVID-19, that we should set aside some of the perhaps privileged ideas about data privacy that we might have had before?
I think one of the questions we've got to try and answer is, what are we trying to achieve? You know, and picking contact tracing as one example. You know, we've seen there are technical solutions here to enable broadly contact tracing without having to reveal lots of additional data. And I think one of the challenges with the UK approach is that we seem to be collecting more data than we need. And I think the principles of data minimization can be applied, and we could probably achieve what we want to do without having to reveal lots of data, much as that additional data might have other uses. I think the question is, what data do we need to have in order to make the decisions that we need to make? And certainly, you know, we've had a number of what I would call data failures in the system in just tracking how many people have died in the UK and getting that reported in a timely way. And all of this information helps us make decisions. So I think whether or not we need to collate lots of information that would jeopardize other areas is the first question to answer. And my suspicion is that we don't need to collect most of the information that people are talking about, and therefore we shouldn't. So
can I put to both of you, you know, we're living in this pandemic era, but the other issue is that the big issue, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement that's going on right now. Do you have any sense, Brittany, perhaps, do you have any sense that the authorities are going to use the pandemic as a way of bringing in further incursions into our private lives via the wooden horse, not the wooden horse, the Trojan horse, shall we say, of COVID-19?
Absolutely. And I have used the term Trojan horse over and over when talking to legislators and journalists and researchers and citizens, just to help everyone understand what this could possibly mean. The amount of data that has been collected in many different of the contact tracing apps used by governments and private companies around the world, as Gavin rightly pointed out, is way more data than is actually needed to complete the task. These data sets should be separately siloed. They should be anonymized or at least pseudonymized so that they cannot be connected with plenty of the other data sets that different organizations, especially governments, might hold. And something that we have specifically put into the new New York state congressional bill, number 8448, which is now online if anyone wants to check it out, is specifically used to be shared with law enforcement. And it be used specifically for the purpose of contact tracing to make sure that we can alert people if they need to self-quarantine, if they've been exposed to someone that has the virus. And that's the point in the first place. Now, obviously, with the surge of both peaceful protests and violent riots going on across the United States, and I believe over 250 cities. There is obviously a massive concern for law enforcement to try to figure out where people are, and especially if they have come into contact with a massive crowd of people where some of these people have been infected. So there's a very fine line that we're walking right now, which is, are we going to be able to stop a massive surge in coronavirus numbers? Or is this going to be abused by police in the same ways that Clearview AI, for instance, has been used to identify and track protesters and arrest peaceful protesters in many countries around the world, and something that has been happening in the US in the past week and a half. So I think we need to be very concerned about how we are going to protect people and their fundamental rights and freedoms, especially when we're seeing right now that there is possibly, again, foreign intervention in our national society and these national movements. In 2016, in the elections, we saw that especially money coming in from Russia was funding, for instance, the organization of Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter rallies in the exact same place in order to hope that it would incite violence. And over the past, week and a half, we have also seen signs that there's perhaps foreign funding coming in for white supremacy groups and groups that are inciting violence, and that is getting blamed on the peaceful protesters. So we need to not only think about contact tracing data, we need to think of the regulation of social media platforms in this instance.
But you were, you were part of Cambridge Analytica, and you decided to turn over evidence as a result of your time there. But you know the Facebook platform intimately. Facebook is still seems to be the place that's where information is effectively weaponized. Do you think that Zuckerberg and the Facebook board has addressed any of the criticisms that happened over the last few years in terms of how people are targeted on their personal data?
I think they have paid lip service in stopping foreign intervention in elections and have addressed nearly none of the other very important concerns that myself and privacy advocates and legislators have levied at them, rightly so, on behalf of the people that are criticizing Facebook, which is that they could do more in order to invest in protecting their users, protecting our elections, and protecting, right now we're seeing, again, foreign intervention and funding that is coming through in order to incite violence in other countries. We are seeing politicians that are allowed to break laws on the Facebook platform because they're not being held to community standards like you and I are. They're allowed to incite violence. They're allowed to incite racial hatred. They're allowed to even spread fake news, disinformation, slander and libel, and voter suppression. So I think Mark Zuckerberg and his board have a lot more work to do, much bigger investments to take. Otherwise, again, the regulators are going to be forced to have them make ethical and moral decisions by using new laws and regulation.
I'd love to get into a discussion about whether or not Facebook's going to get broken up, but we'll have to keep that for another panel. Gavin, I know that you were previously very involved in the moves to open up the UK banking system to allow other players other than the traditional banks to be involved. You wrote the open banking standards that allowed startups like Monzo and Starling Bank and several other challenger banks to appear, and new kinds of fintech startups and financial services, very much about opening up the data. Now, that worked in the financial world, and now you're working on the climate space. I know that you've always been involved and worked in startups in that area previously, but how do you see the what happened in the banking sphere being translated into the fight against climate change and the fight to heal the environment?
Great. Well, let me start actually with the open banking piece, because there's relevance to that today in terms of the COVID response as well. And thanks for claiming me as the author. There was about 150 people involved in authoring, and I helped to co-chair the development of that. So I think one of the pieces of work that's accelerated this year post COVID has been to ask the question: how can we better manage our country's response and our financial response to the crisis. And had we been, I'd say, maybe a couple of years ahead, we would have been in a position to automate a lot of the bailout money that has taken weeks, if not months, to reach people's bank accounts. And that's in no small part down to greater interoperability between the banks because of the open banking standards. The potential there, and I'm also working with a group in Edinburgh to create a global open finance centre of excellence around an economic dashboard where we could use open banking to get permission from each of the businesses in the UK to say, yes, please analyse my bank statements to see if I qualify for the bailout funding. So had we been a little bit further ahead, and obviously that works accelerating rapidly now, we're trying to do in a few weeks what was going to take a number of years. The day after the announcement of effectively shutting the country down and announcing the bailout mechanisms, we could have automated a lot of that for everybody, the banks, the businesses, the individuals, and accelerated the delivery of money into people's bank accounts. So I think that speaks to a very live and active outcome that with the right wiring, with the right sort of data plumbing, if you like, we could do a much better job of meeting the needs of individuals and businesses. We're also now building on that with Icebreaker One to say, how can we start to incorporate some of the climate resilience modeling or the climate vulnerability modeling into those kinds of systems. And I think it's a good example. We could pick many different examples, but if you think that within insurance, well, it's a very dry and subject that people are typically not very interested in. The way that whole industry works at the moment is very, it looks backwards. It looks at what's happened in the last year and changes the premiums. And with a few small exceptions, tends not to look forward. It's not really embodying a lot of the predictive analysis into what the potential risks could be for the system. And when you start to look at incorporate that more into the financial system, you start to see that actually everything's a lot more fragile than we might have thought. And again, COVID has really shone a very bright light on how much do we know about our global supply chains? How much do we really have confidence in the ability for, when there is a systems shock, what are the ripple effects of that? And one of the areas that we're very keen to help work on there is if we can get better access to the information flows, then you can actually start to do some modeling, better planning, and better responses to those shocks.
And it's interesting you should mention supply chains, because I think until the pandemic hit, only rarefied conversations would talk lovingly about the phrase supply chains. It would probably have sent most of us to sleep, including me. But because of the pandemic, because of the lack of PPE, personal protection equipment, because the fact that China turned out to be the global supplier, and in fact also because suddenly being locked into our houses, many of us around the world, needing to go out to get food, to get pharmaceutical drugs, etc., you're suddenly acutely aware that you can't access this stuff very easily unless you can go to the supermarket, etc. And all of this stuff was suddenly deemed to be incredibly dangerous. Where does this pandemic that we've been experiencing and the data privacy meet in terms of, say, for instance, being able to predict things like the need for PPE, the requirements of healthcare authorities? Do you think that, Gavin, just quickly, and then I'll come to you, Brittany, do you think that there is a data privacy aspect to what's happened, especially in regards to the supply chain issues?
Well, I think here I'd rather flip it around and say, how can we better help people? So I think a lot of the ethical debate, if you like, around data tends to focus on harms. And I'm not suggesting for a second that we don't think about the harms. But what I would rather, I prefer to talk about data rights rather than data ethics. And the reason that I do that is I'd rather sit down and say, how could we better enable payments to work across the banking system to the benefit of the banks and to the benefit of customers? Oh, and that leads you to open banking, where it really encapsulates, it covers GDPR, it covers other regulatory instruments. It really looks after the customer in a way that GDPR doesn't actually. It addresses a lot, or tries to address a lot of the gaps in things like GDPR. But from a very pragmatic standpoint of, this is the outcome we're looking for, do I have the right to move this data from A to B? And that's very much underpinning a lot of the work that we're doing. We're starting from the perspective of, here is a problem. What data could help solve that problem? And then can we wire that up in a way that isn't just a technology solution? I think we've got all the technology we could possibly ever want right now to solve most of the world's problems. But the issue around the data sharing is then, do I have the right to move that data from A to B without the sky falling or without some harm being created? And then you can start to look at, who are the actors in that supply chain? Who are the actors in that ecosystem more broadly? What are they allowed to do with the information that they get and that they're sharing? And then if something goes wrong, or when something goes wrong, what are the mechanisms for redress? Who do we complain to? At the moment, if there's a GDPR breach, who do you complain to? It's quite hard to navigate that. Whereas within something like open banking, if something goes wrong there's a very clear line of sight to a regulated framework, which actually ultimately looks after the customer. And we had to address that in a way that we haven't had to address it for social media data, because it's people's bank accounts. It's quite serious information. And so we managed there to move from a situation where everything was kind of held very closely in to the organizations, to a framework and a mechanism where the data could be shared without the sky falling. And I think that way of thinking would be very valuable to us. So looking at other system shocks or other risks, let's look at the use case and say, what do we really need? And again, back to the earlier point of, what do we need versus what would we like to have? Let's focus on the needs.
Brittany, do you want to respond to any of that? And also, would you agree that perhaps that rights rather than the breaches debate should be more emphasized?
So I'll start with the first question that you posed, which I do agree with Gavin, which thinking about it in a way, which is, how do we solve the world's biggest problem right now? What I saw specifically in the supply chain over the past few months is not only to have many things that we require on a daily basis, those supply chains being broken when certain countries are cut off, but all of a sudden when there's, for instance, a massive need for personal protective equipment, the PPE market goes completely exploded, and we have tons of fakes and equipment that is put out into the market specifically for a profit that can't actually protect people. So over the past few years, I've been very involved in the blockchain community, and this seems an appropriate time to talk about this technology, which is tracking and traceability of the supply chain. This is something that I talk about in terms of data rights and tracking and tracing of where your personal data is going and being able to verify it. Similarly, blockchain technology and advanced forms of encryption can help with supply chain when you're looking at demand versus being able to secure that a particular product is what it says it is, and that it is verified, and that it can be shipped and used appropriately, and it's not going to be a faked product. And so I know a lot of blockchain entrepreneurs were working in the supply chain to try to verify that masks that are coming in from other countries, for instance, are being shipped and are going to be able to be used in hospitals. There were also projects where nurses and doctors at hospitals that were being undersupplied were anonymously requesting PPE equipment because there was a surge of nurses and doctors actually losing their jobs for reporting the lack of PPE equipment in hospitals. So when we're talking about privacy, there have actually been a lot of new questions that we haven't thought about that have come up in terms of addressing the supply chain. So that's one thing where I think we do have new forms of technology that will help this a lot, but there are only things across level, and we need to invest in them a lot more before we can fully rely on them running global supply chains altogether. But I would also say, if we're going to talk about data rights versus ethics, It's a bit of both right now, because we do not have data rights in a lot of countries around the world, or we have a lack of sufficient data rights and regulations to protect what should be fundamental rights and freedoms right now. So we have to work around data ethics in order to explain to companies and government departments, yes, you might be able to legally do certain things with the data, but is it appropriate? Is it ethical? Is it moral to do this? I've been working with my friend Tiffany Johnson, who works running the data ethics practice for WPP, the largest advertiser in the world. She's at Wunderman Thompson as a senior data scientist. And she has started a practice where she's working with big companies and brands, multi-billion world, to say, okay, well, there are certain things you could do with data set that you hold, but should you do that? What is an appropriate way to use data so that we are protecting what people's rights should be, especially in the face of the United States not having a federal data protection law?
Yes, and it's interesting you should mention that, because the US has got federal laws, of course, around data, but notably, as you mentioned earlier, the California instituted the CCPA as a kind of a version of GDPR. Given what we know that's going on right now in terms of the pandemic, Gavin, do you think that there's going to be a tension between laws instituted in the last few years, such as GDPR in the EU, the UK leaving GDPR with Brexit, of course, and laws coming out of the US and such as California? How is that going to relate to the fight against the pandemic, Gavin?
I mean, all the small questions, Mike. So I think rolling back out of GDPR, I'm not sure if that's particularly an option, if we're allowed to do that. So I would assume that that's going to persist for as a framework.
You think that the UK is going to toe the line on GDPR for a while, do you?
I think it'd be very hard to backtrack on, and certainly in terms of the UK's kind of smart data strategy, it is a kind of working assumption. I mean, the core principle there is that you own your own data, or you have the rights over your own data, to be more precise. Data ownership is a different question. I think that would be a working assumption for anybody going forward now, is that the customer owns the data or has the rights to control their own data and to opt in and opt out of things. So as to what happens next, I think the constant call, I've probably spent over a decade trying to remind particularly those in government that communication is quite important. We've had quite a number of false starts with the NHS and data generally. And one of the examples that we cited at the beginning of the open banking journey was, let's make sure we try and get the communication right, so that it doesn't just sound that government's mandating that private sector gets free reign over customer data, when it's actually about empowering the customer, or in this case, empowering the citizen as well. And I think whether or not people accept they want to share their data with third parties, whether that's a state actor or a private sector actor, I mean, it's kind of curious in some ways that people get much more anxious about sharing their data with the state than they do with private companies, particularly companies that are not domiciled in the UK. That's maybe an education piece that people could focus on. But I think we just need to have a continuous open public debate about what is the value exchange here. If I'm walking around a supermarket and I get and I know that sharing my purchasing data with the supermarket helps them minimize waste, while that you could play that story in two ways. You could either say we're going to minimize waste or we're going to maximize profit. They're equal stories. They're both deeply correlated with each other. Equally, if I'm sharing my health data with a third party, is it improving my health? Is it improving other people's health? And where are the potential harms? And that's where, when we start talking about specific use cases, then we can talk about specific harms. If I share these sets of information about me and my life, what are the unintended consequences? And can we maybe have that conversation a bit sooner rather than waiting for them to happen? But then there's an absolute role for the state in this and the regulators to have the mechanics and the powers and the ability to keep pace. And actually, a lot of the challenge we face is effectively shortening that cycle between innovation and regulation. So that the system itself, rather than saying, because most organizations or governance structures tend to shut things down if things go badly, rather than embracing them and say, how can we make this work for the use case? How can we minimize the potential risks? How can we minimize the harms? How can we maximize the benefits? So the data sharing economy here has a lot of work to do, because the technology is there. I don't really care what the technology platform or mechanism is. The point is we've got the web, so the data is going to flow somewhere.
You're right. Sorry, you were going to continue.
No, go on. Yep.
Right, and I just wanted to on that note, the data absolutely is going to flow somewhere, but at the moment it looks like it's going to be flowing even more between the UK and the US, because the UK wants a trade deal. So it looks like there's going to be some sort of the UK is going to be stuck between trying to reconcile GDPR and US data safe harbor laws. Brittany, what's your view on how that's going to play out? Obviously, Brexit was partly nudged towards. We were all nudged towards Brexit and voting for Brexit by the Vote Leave, which used Cambridge Analytica data. That's absolutely on the record on Facebook. Do you think that there's going to be a fight coming between data privacy in the UK and the US as Brexit happens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think since GDPR was enacted, the US has struggled to find something that addresses similar concerns in terms of protecting citizens' privacy and giving them some data rights, while the two main parties are still duking it out in Congress. So luckily in California, we managed to get through the California Consumer Protection Act. And I really think that as you asked Gavin just a few minutes ago, does the enactment of GDPR and CCPA, are we going to see a problem with that because of the pandemic? And I've definitely seen a relaxing around the world of, enforced. I really think that as you asked Gavin just a few minutes ago, does the enactment of GDPR and CCPA, are we going to see a problem with that because of the pandemic? And I've definitely seen a relaxing around the world of, enforced. I totally side with the small and medium-sized businesses that are hurting right now. Unemployment is at an all-time high. I totally understand that business owners and people running their companies are really figuring out how to make ends meet, and paying for compliance doesn't make sense to them right now. So they're being given more leniency than what those laws originally asked in terms of timeline for compliance. So we definitely have taken a huge hit, I would say, to the momentum that the data rights movement has had. I don't think we're going to see a rolling back of those laws. I just think we're going to see a lot more of an understanding of how governments can help inform companies, help raise awareness for citizens for how this compliance is actually going to look. CCPA right now is about to have an update led by the amazing Alistair McTaggart, who hopefully this will get through in the next few months. But the state of California is actually a huge financial assistance patch for companies that do not have the financial ability to stretch their capacity to CCPA compliance. I've also been working for since last year with the state of New York on the New York Privacy Act, which goes even further than CCPA. Obviously, we've been held in our tracks, same with the work that we've been doing with the federal government to try to get a national data protection law through. So I definitely think that the UK the UK, not just the UK, but the entirety of the EU as well. The UK now has to deal with separate compliance, and we're dealing with the US, where many companies are trying to comply with CCPA, and everybody has kind of wiped this off their table to figure out more fundamental issues like continuing to pay people's salaries. So we're trying to keep education and awareness at an all-time high, especially when our data rights are being threatened by some of the ways that we're trying the pandemic. But in the US, we're in an election year too, so we're going to see a lot more problems than a normal year too.
We've got some audience questions flooding in here, so let's do a quick fire Q&A with the audience here. Do you think that, Gavin, do you think people will give up their data for helping the planet?
Well, again, I'd start with the question of which data to solve which problem, right? So I think we need to look at, what are the areas where we can actually have any agency over that. So the vast majority of our emissions come from energy production, which individuals don't have much say over at the moment. But one of the pieces of work that we've just initiated last week, in fact, is to translate the principles and practice of open banking into open energy. And how could we do that across the UK? And that's very much as a response to the overall change in dynamic where both energy supply and energy demand is increasing in complexity. So we've got far more points of energy generation, right down to solar panels on someone's house, right the way through to many more forms of demand, where a battery might be in someone's home or in someone's car. And so if we're wanting people to share their energy consumption patterns back, that would be, for me, in the same broad category as open banking. The customer owns the data. Do we want them to share it back to enable people to better load balance the whole energy grid? And just as an illustration there, in one country where they were installing batteries in a domestic situation, the batteries were negotiating when they should charge themselves, but they were negotiating based on price. And so that actually pushed the emissions of the country up because they were negotiating on price, and the lowest cost of energy was actually the highest carbon. So we need to integrate the carbon intensity of the grid into the calculation in order to drive us towards a net zero future. And that's kind of one of the kind of interesting examples to me, because it really sort of brings it to life. Do you want to share the information from your energy meter and so on, which, again, nobody really cares. It's just, I want to boil a kettle, right? It's the thing people want to do here.
Exactly.
We just want to care about the data. But if there's a mechanism where we have to give that information back to somebody else for a shared benefit, then I think there is a strong argument to that. But that's about communication. We've got to tell the story.
You've got to tell the story. Brittany, do you think the governments around the world are going to be able to tell the story correctly in order to get people to give up their health data, tell them if they've got a fever, tell them if they've developed COVID-19 symptoms, and that they'll do that for the duration of the pandemic? And do you think that people will continue to do that and be happy with that? Or do you think that they will become more aware of the data that they're giving out and perhaps start to demand more when the pandemic is over?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is why I started the Own Your Data Foundation in the first place, is to raise education and awareness on how people can understand what their data is, what their rights should be, how to keep your data private, and how, if you so choose to share your data, that you could contribute to solving a lot of the world's greatest problems. I mean, I really think that the future of data ownership and data rights is that data can be the great equalizer. If we all have ownership and control over what our data is going to be used for, we can opt in, we fully understand informed consent to using our data for good purposes, because we will know that it is protected. And I really think that For instance, if I were to be told that I could stop coronavirus, I could solve cancer, yes, I would share my sensitive medical data if I knew that I had clear, informed consent over who is going to get access to that data, that it's going to be anonymized, how long it's going to be held, exactly what it's going to be used for. And if it is monetized, then I get a portion of that value. That is the possibility, and that is really the future of what we're looking to do here. I'm not telling people keep all of your data private. I'm really more into radical transparency than privacy. So I would like to encourage people to share data, but we need to have the laws and regulations in place to protect people from abuse. We need to have education and awareness so people understand that opting into these things can be safe and can be a great idea. You can input into a predictive algorithm that is live around the world. And we also, in the end, need the technology in order to secure our data as well, which is why I'm such a blockchain advocate.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. It's been a great session to talk about data and privacy in our new world. Thank you, Brittany Kaiser from Own Your Data Foundation. I'm sure you can find her just on your favorite search engine. And from Gavin Starks from the enigmatically titled Icebreaker 1. Thanks very much for joining this session at the CogX conference. My name is Mike Butcher from TechCrunch. And back to our wonderful MCs.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.